Good morning and welcome to the August safety meeting provided by Basin Safety. I'm Kevin Hobby with Basin Safety, and today we're going to be covering powered industrial trucks and forklift safety, aerial lift safety, and finally we'll get into rigging and materials handling. These are very common jobs on our work sites. Almost every job site you go to will have some type of front end loader, some type of man basket. We'll definitely be doing some type of rigging and materials handling. So we felt like this would be a good topic to cover for this month. During this, we're going to go over the site and job assessment and inspection, basic forklift safety, basic aerial lift safety, basic rigging and material handling safety, the importance of inspections, the requirements of documentation for these jobs, and regulations regarding out-of-service equipment. So before we get any job started, the most important thing is to do a proper JSA, JHA. Make sure that you assess the job site so that you can figure out the hazards that are associated with that specific site. Make sure that you have all the materials that you need. This includes inspecting your materials to make sure that your tools and everything are in good working condition. Make sure that you have the proper documentation prior. If you need a work permit or something of that sort, make sure that you have it. Make sure that's all good. There's nothing worse than getting in the middle of a job and realizing that you don't have the proper paperwork. So getting into powered industrial trucks, the main things that we're going to cover in this, we're going to go over different types of powered industrial trucks, understand the requirements of OSHA Regulation 1910-178, and understand the requirements for the safe operation of powered industrial trucks. So, powered industrial truck and forklift types. OSHA recognizes 11 different designations of industrial trucks. Each type of vehicle has its own special safety guards, its own proper working conditions, and things like that. It's up to your employer to select the proper type of vehicle to match the hazard profile of the work environment. So you don't want to use, let's say, a basic retail forklift if we're going to be on site moving pipe, things like that. It can create additional hazards. We just like anything else, we want to make sure that we have the proper tools. Diesel forklifts. These are broken into a couple of different categories. DS. These are like the D types, but have additional safeguards to the exhaust, fuel, and electrical systems. We've got an image of one here off to the right. DY is like the DS, but they do not have any electrical equipment, and it's equipped with temperature limiting features. This is to prevent overheating, any type of damage to the lines that could be caused by exhaust fuel or exhaust heat rather, and things like that. Electrical forklifts, this is not something that we typically deal with here in the oil and gas industry. These are more of a retail setting. However, there are a few instances where you're going to have them if you're, say, loading chemicals in a shop or something along those lines. So we have an ES, which is like the basic E-types, but they're provided additional safeguards to the electrical system to prevent emission of hazardous sparks and to limit surface temperatures. This is what we would call the forklift version of an intrinsically safe or an explosion proof, kind of like our tools that we use on site. EE is like ES, but the electrical motors and all other electrical equipment is completely enclosed. That's to prevent oxygen from being able to get in there in order to create a combustion. EX, the electrical fittings and equipment are so designed, constructed, and assembled that the units may be used in certain atmospheres containing flammable vapors or dusts. G, or gas forklifts. The GS designated units are gasoline-powered units that are provided with additional safeguards to the exhaust, fuel, and electrical systems. They may be used in some locations where the use of a G unit may not be considered suitable. L are liquid petroleum gas forklifts. These are what you see a lot in big box retail stores like Lowe's and Home Depot. They're mostly powered by propane. Some of them can be powered by butane or some other type of liquid natural gas. The LP designated unit is similar to the G unit, except that liquefied petroleum gas is used for fuel instead of gasoline. The LPS designated units are liquefied petroleum gas powered units that are provided with additional safeguards to the exhaust, fuel, and electrical systems. They may be used in some locations where the use of an LP unit may not be considered suitable. It's important to select the type of vehicle that is appropriate for your work environment and load. Refer to Table N1 in the OSHA Instruction 1910-178 for guidelines on the appropriate equipment selection. Any modifications or additions that may affect capacity or safe operation must have written approval of the manufacturer. All markings, plates, tags, or decals shall be changed accordingly. Forklifts can present additional hazards whenever we're getting into certain types of atmospheres. This is just like anything else, guys. We really want to make sure that we're using the proper equipment. Here's a list of some atmosphere contaminants that will cause you to not be able to use certain types of forklifts. Always refer to the operator's manual or the OSHA regulation whenever it comes to this. So, this is something that we really want to cover. Make sure your load is stable. Never overload. That's a very common cause of incidents, is people will put too much weight on the front of it, or you'll see people with a loader that will try to counter it. Some loaders will have counterweights for when they are getting too heavy, but this doesn't mean like have a couple of guys stand on the back of it to give it more weight in the back so you can lift more. While that may keep it more stable, it can present additional hazards for those that are riding on the back, obviously. But the other thing is the masts and the hydraulic lines on these are only rated for certain things. So even if you're able to counter the weight in the back, you're still putting a overload on the mast itself, on the forks, on the hydraulic lines, things like that. So when we're talking about this, don't only think about, okay, the weight rating for the front. Think about the positioning of the weight itself, because if it's to one side or the other, whenever you're making a turn, you could cause a tilt or a rollover. Just make sure that your weight is centered. Make sure that everything is exactly to the manufacturer's standards. These are designed to be used in a very particular way, and most incidents occur whenever we're not using them that way. Remember the forklift stability triangle? Nearly all counterbalance PITs have a 3-point suspension system. When the load center is inside the stability triangle, the load is balanced. When the load center is outside the triangle, the vehicle could tip over. Remember, whenever you're extending your forks or trying to retract your forks, that you keep it stable. Longitudinal stability is the truck resistance to turning over, forward, or rearward. And lateral stability is the truck's resistance to overturning sideways. So make sure that you're paying special attention. As your forks get further out, that changes your center weight and can cause a tip forward. As you're pulling the weight back, it could cause a tip backwards if the weight shifts too quickly. And then, of course, from side to side, you just really want to make sure that your load is as close to the center as possible. That way it doesn't tip over. The further out that you extend your forks, the more likely you are to cause a tip one way or another. Dynamic stability. Dynamic stability is the effect that dynamic forces have on the load center when the machine is moving, braking, cornering, lifting, tilting, and lowering loads. Dynamic stability varies depending on the size of the load, the speed of motion, and the angle. There are no guidelines for managing dynamic stability. This is always better to use your best judgment for how quickly you're moving, how stable the load is, etc. Fuel storage. The storage and handling of liquid fuels such as gasoline and diesel must be in accordance with NFPA Flammable and Combustible Liquids Code 30-1969. The storage and handling of liquefied petroleum gas must be in accordance with NFPA Storage and Handling of Liquefied Petroleum Gases Code 58-1969. Equipment components. On most of them, you'll have the overhead guard, your lift cylinder, your tilt cylinder, the mast, the forks, the auxiliary seat brake, your seat belt, and your horn. Some of them will be designed differently. This will be covered in your manufacturer guidelines. It will identify different safety features, different work features, and things like that that could change this setup. The main things to remember are how far back you can tilt it, how far out you can extend it. Most of these will have a weight indicator and an angle indicator. Make sure that you're paying attention to that. Safe vehicle operations. Common sense can be your best protection when using powered industrial trucks. Always drive slowly and carefully. Your speed dramatically affects your load center and its position in the stability triangle. When traveling with a load, keep it low. Equipment inspection. The operator should perform a brief vehicle inspection prior to every shift. Include these basic inspection items as well as any required by the owner's manual. Once again, you want to review your owner's manual and go by your manufacturer guidelines. A lot of these will have specialty equipment. They will have different things from brand to brand that could cause the inspections to be a little bit different. Working on and around vehicles. Do not drive trucks up to people standing or sitting in front of fixed objects. You don't want to put them between themselves and between you and an immovable object, rather. This can cause serious incidents, such as caught between, pinch points, things like that. People should not pass below elevated portions of the truck, so try not to do overhead lifts. There are special permits for overhead lifts whenever that has to occur. However, you will probably not run into a situation like that, and if you are, you will have special instructions. Only vehicles designed for carrying a passenger may have one, so don't have somebody hanging off the back or off to the side or something like that. Arms and legs may not be placed outside of the mast or the running lines of the vehicle. Vehicle entry and exit. Always enter and leave a powered industrial truck facing the vehicle. If a sit-down vehicle tips over, remain seated in the operator's seat and lean away from the direction of the fall. If a stand-up rider truck tips over, step backwards off the vehicle to get clear. What happens a lot of the time is when these are tipping, people will try to jump and are crushed by the overhead guard. Or they will panic and stick their arm outside to try and stabilize themselves, and then it gets crushed by the top mast or any of the other parts as they land. Leaving vehicles unattended. A PIT is considered to be unattended when the operator is greater than 25 feet from it or the vehicle is not in his view. When a vehicle is unattended, it must have its controls neutralized, have the load engaging means fully lowered, have its power shut off, and have its brakes set. Have its wheels blocked off if it's on an incline as well. Traveling with the vehicle. When traveling with the vehicle, maintain 3 lengths from the vehicle ahead. Yield the right-of-way for emergency vehicles. Slow the vehicle and sound the horn when crossing areas with obstructed views. Cross railroad tracks diagonally when possible. Ascend and descend grades slowly. These are just basic guidelines, guys. It's always best to use your judgment and common sense whenever you're driving, because you know your facilities better than we do. Make sure that you're assessing the job prior and that you're very aware of all the hazards, the intersections, high traffic areas, low traffic areas, and how to prevent incidents in those areas. Loading. Only stable and safely arranged loads should be handled. Loads must be below the rated capacity of the vehicle. Trucks with attachments must be operated as partially loaded, even when not carrying a load. Engaging a load. When engaging a load, the engaging means must be placed under the load as far as possible. The mast must be carefully tilted backwards to stabilize the load. Do not tilt the engaging means forward except when picking up a load. Traveling with the load. When traveling with a load, if possible, the load engaging means should be tilted back slightly. The load should only be raised enough to clear the road surface. If the load obstructs forward view, travel with the load trailing, which is just a fancy way of saying drive backwards. When traveling grades in excess of 10%, loaded trucks must be driven with the load upgrade. Vehicles not in a safe operating condition must be removed from service. Only authorized personnel can make repairs. Repairs to fuel and ignition systems must be made in designated areas. The battery must be disconnected before repairs on the electrical system can recur. This is just like any other vehicle, guys. Make sure that you're taking them to a properly trained individual. You wouldn't take your car to an IT guy to get it fixed, right? So don't take your forklift to somebody that's not aware of the inner workings of them. Even though these are basic mechanical vehicles, there are some special hazards. There are some things to keep in mind. So make sure that you're using an authorized mechanic. Training requirements. No one is allowed to drive powered industrial trucks until they have been trained and certified by the employer. The minimum age to drive is 18. Trainees must be supervised at all times while operating. Another caveat to this is to make sure that you're trained in the particular type of forklift that you're using. If you've only used a small electrical powered retail forklift, don't jump all the way to a front end loader immediately. Make sure that you're trained on that very particular type, as they can have different hazards, different loads, load stabilities, things like that. So in summary, the four major classifications of powered industrial trucks are E, electrically powered, D, diesel powered, G, gasoline powered, and L, liquefied petroleum gas. Remember the stability triangle? Longitudinal stability is the truck's resistance to turning over forward or rearward. Lateral stability is the truck's resistance to overturning sideways. Dynamic stability is the effect and dynamic forces, the effect that dynamic forces have, rather, on the load center when the machine is moving, braking, cornering, lifting, tilting, and lowering loads. The minimum age to drive a powered industrial truck is 18. Employees must be trained and evaluated in forklift operations prior to operating them alone. Moving on to basic aerial lift safety training. During this, we'll learn to understand the operator training requirements for aerial lifts, understand inspection requirements, understand site evaluations and safe work practices for aerial lifts, and demonstrate the ability to safely operate an aerial lift. Part 1. Aerial lift introduction. Accident prevention. Ensure a competent person conducts frequent inspections of the worksite. Only allow qualified or trained personnel to operate aerial lifts. Train each employee in the recognition and avoidance of unsafe conditions and regulations applicable to his or her work environment. Prohibit unauthorized persons from operating aerial lifts, and ensure personnel stay inside of the lift at all times and use proper fall protection. A lot of these are going to be just like what we covered in the powered industrial truck. The main things to remember are that you're trained in that very particular type of aerial lift, and that you have a competent person on site that's doing these inspections and making sure that it's in good working order. When aerial lifts malfunction due to poor maintenance, it can be catastrophic. If somebody's tied into this, it's not like a lot of other powered industrial vehicles. Most of the time you're going to be tied to it with really no way to get out, because that is your platform. So we want to make sure that we're being extra safe whenever we're using these. Make sure that you're tied off all the time. One of the most commonly cited OSHA citations is people not being tied off while in the man basket or a raised work platform. Also, you should avoid using them to lift things. They are not designed to lift weighted loads. They're designed to hoist personnel only. So try not to load pallets of different things on them. I know it can be more convenient. However, we don't want to use equipment for things that it's not designed for. That's how we malfunction, and that's how we create incidents where there really shouldn't be. Aerial lift requirements. Aerial lifts must be compliant with the ANSI standard A92-2018. Aerial lifts must have the following markings: identification, including the serial and model number, operational information, and instructional information. Part 2. Aerial lift training requirements. Only employees who have received training regarding the inspection, application, and operation of aerial devices, including hazard management, may operate an aerial device. Your company will keep records of the training, so who's trained on what particular type, when it was, and if they feel like there's a refresher course. At a minimum, employees must be trained on the purpose and use of the manuals, that operating manuals are an integral part of the aerial device and must be properly stored on the vehicle when not in use, how to perform a pre-start inspection, responsibilities associated with problems or malfunctions with an aerial lift, and factors affecting stability. Most of these will be model and then site specific, so if you're working in a particular area that has unstable grounding or constantly changing grounding, then you're going to have to take special precautions in order to mitigate those hazards. This should be covered by your supervisor or in your JSA or JHA. Training requirements continued. The purpose of placards and details, how to perform a workplace inspection, applicable safety rules and regulations such as the National Electric Safety Code, the purpose and use of the manuals, that operating manuals are an integral part of the aerial device and must be properly stored on the vehicle when not in use, the required authorization to operate, any specific warning and instructions for that aerial lift, knowledge of the specific type of equipment they are operating, the proper use of fall protection equipment, operating different or new equipment. When an already trained operator needs to operate a new piece of equipment, or one that they haven't been evaluated on, the following must be verified. They must know the location of the operator's manual. They must understand the controls and limitations of that particular equipment. They must know how to properly inspect the equipment. They must be evaluated for the skill on the equipment itself. So just because somebody has been using aerial lifts for 20 years, if a new type is brought in, we really need to make sure that they are trained in that specific type. We want to make sure that they're aware of all of the features and safety functions of that particular model. Just because you know one or you've operated a lot of different ones does not necessarily indicate that you're going to be proficient in operating a new one. Part 3. Aerial lift inspection and maintenance requirements. Frequent inspection requirements. You want to check the operating controls and any associated mechanisms for any conditions that would interfere with proper operation. Check visual and audible safety devices for malfunctions. So these are going to be your rear view, your side view mirrors, your backup horn, any backup alarms, your forward going horn, any of that type of stuff. Check hydraulic or pneumatic systems for observable deterioration or excessive leakage. So this is just if you can glance at it and see anything leaking. You don't really have to go in depth with taking these apart to make sure that the fittings have the proper gaskets and things like that unless you see a leak. This is just going to be a quick visual inspection that you'll do pre-job. Check fiberglass and other insulating components for visible damage or contamination. Check for missing or illegible operational and instructional markings. Check electrical systems for malfunction, signs of excessive deterioration, dirt, and moisture accumulation. Perform a visual inspection of all bolts, pins, fasteners, and locking devices for looseness or deformation. Any suspected items should be examined and tested, and a determination must be made by a qualified person if they are a safety hazard. All unsafe items must be replaced or repaired before the aerial lift is used. Frequent inspection records. Records are not required for these frequent inspections. However, your employer may have a booklet or something like that. Just be sure to check with them. If a safety violation is found during a frequent inspection, it must be reported in writing. That report and the record of the corrective action must be kept for at least 5 years. Aerial lift modifications. No modifications or additions that affect vehicle stability, mechanical, hydraulic, or electrical integrity, or safe operation may be made without prior written permission from the manufacturer. If these changes are made, the instructional markings must be changed accordingly. So as you're changing these, make sure that you're updating the markings on them to indicate how the changes are going to affect the way that it operates. Aerial lift operations. Pre-start inspections. Aerial devices must be inspected prior to each day's operation. The operator must perform the inspection in accordance with the frequent inspection requirements. All unsafe items must be replaced or repaired before each use. Weather conditions. Before using aerial lifts outdoors, weather conditions should be checked. Lifts should not be used when there are storms, high winds, or the possibility of lightning. We run into this all the time in the field where the winds will be too high up here in the Bakken for the aerial lift to operate properly. It can increase your likelihood of tip over, of load shifting, and just generally interfere with your operations of these aerial lifts. Work area hazard survey. Before an aerial device is used, the work area must be surveyed for hazards such as unstable soil, holes, ditches, drop-offs and floor obstructions, any type of debris, overhead obstructions, possible electrical contacts, the presence of unauthorized persons. Aerial lifts may not be used unless these hazards are managed or eliminated. So once these hazards have been identified, you want to identify in your JSA or JHA how you're going to mitigate or avoid these hazards. This can be restabilizing the ground. If it's uneven, it can be putting up caution tape if there's a likelihood of somebody getting in the area that's not supposed to be. It can really be anything. Just make sure that you're documenting and identifying it. Protection from falling objects. Employees must wear hard hats. If there's a danger of falling objects from the platform, the area below must be barricaded and employees prevented from entering. If employees need to access the areas beneath the platform, tow boards, screens, and canopies must be used to protect employees from the falling object hazards. It's also a really good idea, even if you're in the man basket, to go ahead and tether your tools just like you would if you were working overhead in like a bow swing chair or something. Moving aerial lifts. While driving an aerial lift, the driver must avoid any surface that affects vehicle stability, maintain a safe distance from obstacles and overhead lines, maintain communications between the driver and operator, limit speed to a rate that is safe for the conditions of the surface, which means slowly and carefully. So make sure that you're not really getting in too much of a hurry in one of these, as they can be pretty unstable. If it is a type where you're operating it from the basket, I'm sure some of you have felt it shake and tilt as you're going if you get going too fast over an uneven surface, and that can cause some incidents pretty quick. You can bounce up and hit your head on something. The unit itself can tip forward or backward or to the side. So just make sure you're using common sense and taking all the proper precautions while operating an aerial lift. Vehicle stability. This is just like the forklift, guys, because we're still extending a boom, we're still putting a weight on the end of it, even though that weight is an individual. You just want to make sure that you have your load weight centered as you're moving. Make sure that you're aware of how far tilted out you are, etc. Once again, just like the forklifts, dynamic stability. Make sure that you're aware of how fast you're going and how that's going to affect the weight distribution. Make sure that you're aware of how fast you're taking turns. All of that good stuff, just like you would a forklift, even though now instead of using a load of material, you have a load of people. Working requirements. Employees must stand on the floor of the basket and cannot sit or climb on the edges or use other devices to establish work positions. A harness attached to the boom or basket must be worn. Harness should be connected to a lift structure member anchor point. Guardrails must be installed. Never exceed the load capacity of the aerial lift. Another thing to add in here is to make sure that your belt is in good working order, that you don't have any rips or tears, or it's not oil soaked. Make sure that it's within its inspection guidelines, and really pay attention to where you're connecting it. They're going to be engineered anchor points. These are set up, they're load tested, they are typically put in the strongest sections of the man basket in order to absorb maximum impact in the event of a fall. So don't just tie off to anything. Make sure that you're using everything exactly the way it should be. Make sure you're inspecting your belt prior. Make sure you're covering this in your JSA and JHA. Working requirements. The parking brake must be set while the boom is elevated. Wheel chocks must be installed before using an aerial lift on an incline. Aerial lift trucks should not be moved when the boom is elevated and workers are in the basket. So, to wrap up, here are a few things to take into account when operating aerial lifts and powered industrial trucks. Test the lift controls prior to using the lift. Allow only trained persons to operate an aerial lift. Ensure fall protection is worn at all times. Ensure employees always stand firmly on the floor of the basket. Do not sit or climb on the edge of the basket. Use planks, ladders, or other devices for a better work position. Ensure that boom and basket load limits specified by the manufacturer are not exceeded. In summary, all aerial lifts must be compliant with the applicable ANSI regulations. All operators must be trained and certified prior to operating an aerial lift. Frequent inspections must be performed daily prior to use. Periodic inspections are in-detail inspections that must be performed and recorded in accordance with the manufacturer's recommendations. Work on aerial lifts should not be performed during lightning conditions or heavy weather. The work area must be checked for hazards prior to using aerial lifts. Basic safe rigging. Definitions. Rigging. The connecting of a load to a source of power so that it can be lifted and moved safely and predictably. A safe working load is the maximum allowable working load established by the manufacturer. Balanced. This means that the load is equally distributed on each side of the point of support. Braking strength. The approximate point when under maximum load that the load handling device fails. Bridle sling. A sling composed of multiple legs gathered in a fitting that goes over the lifting hook. And a competent person. This is selected or assigned by the employer as being qualified to perform a specific job or task. Further definitions. A hitch or a basket. This is loading with the sling passed under the load and both ends on the hook or a single master link. A hitch or a choker. Loading with the sling passed through one eye and suspended by the other. Hitch, vertical. Loading with the load suspended vertically on a single part or leg of the sling. Master link. A steel link or ring used to support all legs of a chain or wire rope sling. Mousing. Lashing between the neck and the tip of the hook to prevent the load from sliding off. Rated capacity. The maximum available workload. A sheave. A wheel or groove circumference over which a rope is bent. Wire rope. Consists of many individual wires laid into a number of strands which are in turn laid around a center core. Job site considerations. The handling and setting and erection of materials and equipment can be hazardous. Each operation presents its own peculiar problem, and no two jobs are alike. With proper preparation and planning, these jobs can be done successfully. Authorized and qualified personnel must always pay close attention to all aspects of the job. Once again, this goes back to our JSA and our JHA. These should be site-specific, and they should review all of the hazards with that very specific area, the very specific equipment that you're going to be using, the equipment that you're going to be lifting, the considerations for personnel in that area, and any specialty hazards such as wildlife, low-lying areas, etc. Step 1. Selecting rigging. A knowledgeable personnel should select the rigging. 2. The rigging condition. The rigging must be of the appropriate type, have the proper identification, and you need to verify that it's been inspected and certified. Number 3. Load limits. Consider the load weight, the center of gravity, the sling angle, side loading considerations, and gear capacity. Step 4. Controlling the load. Taglines must be present and utilized. Keep in mind the possibility of a failure and what you're going to do if it does fail. If the load shifts out of reason, or if your rigging itself breaks. While doing that, make sure that you're aware of the location of personnel in the area. Step 5. Consider unfavorable conditions such as wind, temperature, ground conditions like ice, mud, water. Load responsibilities. The rigger's responsibilities. UFC. Utilize. Utilize appropriate rigging gear suitable for overhead lifting. Follow. Follow industry standards and the manufacturer's recommendations. Conduct. Conduct regular inspection and maintenance of the rigging gear. Basic sling operating practices, as covered in ANSI B39. Whenever any sling is used, the following practices shall be observed. 1. Slings that are damaged or defective shall not be used. 2. Slings shall not be shortened with knots or bolts or other makeshift devices. Sling legs shall not be kinked. 4. Slings shall not be loaded in excess of their rated capacity. 5. Slings used in a basket hitch shall have the load balanced to prevent slippage. 6. Slings shall be securely attached to the load. 7. Slings shall be padded or protected from the sharp edges of their loads. 8. Suspended loads shall be kept free of obstructions. 9. All employees shall be kept clear of loads about to be lifted and of suspended loads. 10. Hands or fingers shall not be placed between the sling and its load while the sling is being tightened around the load. 11. Shock loading is prohibited. 12. A sling shall not be pulled from under a load when the load is resting on the sling. Basic sling operation practices. ANSI B399. Each day before using the sling, all fastenings and attachments shall be inspected for damage and defects by a competent person. Any additional inspections shall be performed during sling use as often as necessary to assure the safety of that operation. Basic operating practices continued. Replacement criteria. Severe localized abrasion or scraping. 10 randomly distributed broken wires in one rope lay, or 5 broken wires in one rope strand in one rope lay. Evidence of heat damage, such as being cut by a torch. Kinking, crushing, bird caging, or any damage resulting in distortion of the rope structure itself. Damaged, distorted, or field welded hooks. Damaged or worn in attachments. Here are some examples of wire rope construction. On the left we have right lay or correct lay. Broken down into components. So here's your core, your strand, there's a wire rope, and this is the wrap off to the right. Types of wire rope sling damage. This is what we call bird cage damage. This is damage as a result of a kink in the wire rope. Synthetic slings. Here's some examples of those. On the left we've got a vertical hitch, and on the right a choker hitch. Chain slings. There are various types of these. Refer to your company's policy about which ones are acceptable. Whenever you're using these, make sure that you're checking the tag, make sure that it has been inspected lately, and make sure that it's not damaged in any way that could affect the integrity of the lift. Rigging protection from cutting or slipping. These can be softeners, padding, or the use of blocking. Protecting rigging from damage or the environment. Rigging components are expensive to buy and to replace, so taking care of them is the number one thing. They should be selected, used, and stored properly. Keep wire rope slings lubricated and all rigging stored out of the weather. Treat the rigging as though your life depended on it, because it does. Don't use makeshift rigging or attempt to repair any rigging components. Knots tied in rigging can reduce the strength by 50% or more. In conclusion, ensure rigging equipment and method are designed to manage your load. Coordinate with crane operators and ensure everyone has adequate credentials prior to work. Perform site assessment prior to work to ensure no additional hazards exist, or if so, they are mitigated properly. Never rig or load alone. This concludes our August safety meeting. Thank you. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out. We would love to help.